Good evening and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Lovely to see you all. You know, sometimes my job requires me to be in two places at once, which in the olden days, pre-COVID, was quite a challenge. Nowadays, Baruch Hashem, I have the ability to do so. Giving shiurim over Zoom means that at the moment I am attending a fundraising dinner for our school, Libli Avne College, but at the same time, I'm able to deliver this pre-recorded shiur to you this evening. I hope you are all doing very well. I hope I'm also doing well, and I am pleased to share this shiur together with you. For the parashiot of Vayakel and Pekudei, which conclude the book of Shmot. And if you have a sense of deja vu when you reach these parashiot, you can be forgiven. The details we're going to see in these parashiot are details we've seen before. Overall, Ramban Nachmanides counts 5 accounts of the building of the Mishkan in the second half of the book of Shmot. You will notice in your Chumashim that even Rashi gives up towards the end of the book of Shmot. We've seen it all before. There's nothing new to comment about. Nevertheless, there is something really beautiful and really significant about these parashiot, because if we consider the context of the sin of the Egel HaZahav, which has taken place not long before, and that now we have an opportunity to build a home for Hashem, and when in these parashiot Hashem moves back to us and His Shekhinah rests among us, this is a really meaningful and really significant and emotional description which we are reading in these parashiot. And we see how much the people were motivated and excited and desired to contribute towards this important project. In fact, the fundraising project for the building of the Mishkan was, if there could even be such a thing, too successful. And so we read in source number 1, Vayikhu melifnei Moshe et kol hatruma sheheviu bnei Israel limlechet avodat hakodesh la'asot ota. And so the chief artisans and the people involved in fashioning and forming the different parts of the Mishkan would take from before Moshe all of the donations which the Bnei Yisrael brought towards the building of the different parts of the Mishkan. And every single morning there would be more donations which were delivered. And then vayavou kol hachachamim haosim et kol melechet hakodesh ish mimalachto asher hema osim. And so all of the wise people who were making each part of this holy project, each person came from the work that they were doing. Vayomru el Moshe, and they said to Moshe le'mor as follows: Marbim ha'am lahavi midei havodah lamlacha shetzivah Hashem lasot ota. Marbim ha'am. The people are bringing too much for the work of this project that Hashem has commanded us to do. As a result, Vayetzav Moshe, and Moshe commanded, Vayaviru kol b'machaneh le'mor, and a great announcement went out in the camp as follows: Ish v'isha al yasu od malacha letrumat hakodesh. Ladies and gentlemen, please, don't do any more work for this holy donation. And as a result, Vayikale ha'am mehavi, the people stopped bringing. They ceased from making those donations. And then we read, in summary, V'amalacha hayta dayam l'chol hamalacha la'asot ota. The work was enough for everything that needed to be done. Ve'hoter, and there was some left over too. There was a surplus. And there are a few questions I would like to ask about this passage, but before we get into those questions, I just want to share with you a passage from Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, which really describes the beauty of the passage which we just read. And he comments in his Emet Yaakov in source 2. Bo re'eh yikarot v'chavivot hamitzvah. Yikrut v'chavivot hamitzvah. Let's have a look at the incredible way that we treasured and cherished the mitzvah. Sharei kama kesef v'zahav avanim tovot v'chadome nishtaka b'binyan hamishkan. See how much gold and silver and precious stones were invested in the building of the Mishkan. And for a number of months we toiled in making this Mishkan. But as far as we knew at that stage, how long was the Mishkan supposed to last for? Uve'emet, in truth, lo hayu tzrichin oto ela chodashim achadim. This Mishkan was only ever meant to serve them for a few months. Because we need to remember, if not for the sin of the Meraglim, which delayed us 40 years in the Midbar, we were on a direct route to the land of Israel. And we would have arrived in Israel, and there we would have built a Beit HaMikdash out of Avanim, out of stone. והרי נמצא שכל יגיעתם הייתה רק לקיום מצוות, ועשו לי מקדש ושכנתי בתוכם. So all of this effort and all of this toil and everything that they did and invested was just for the purpose of fulfilling the mitzvah when Hashem said, ועשו לי מקדש ושכנתי בתוכם. Hashem said, make a sanctuary for me where I can rest amongst them. So we invested so much effort and so much of our own funds and precious jewelry and items for the building of a very short-term project. It was just to build a home for Hashem. And very soon we were going to build a Beit HaMikdash in Israel itself. But nevertheless, we invested with great alacrity and excitement and love in this project. And from here, Rabbi Kamenetsky teaches, the truth is, none of us know the reward which lies in wait for different mitzvot. None of us have a godometer which can tell us that according to God, if we do this mitzvah, we get that amount of reward. If you get that mitzvah, you get another reward. We don't know the relative value of mitzvot. As a result, we have to be just as careful with mitzvot, which we might perceive to be less significant, as we are with mitzvot, which we view to be very important and significant. We might think it's an easy mitzvah, a difficult mitzvah, a small, big mitzvah. It doesn't make a difference. We have to treat every mitzvah with the equal importance and value and investment. Imkain. Every single mitzvah, we may not think it's that important or it's got that much reward or it's of such great value. Nevertheless, we have to work hard and give of ourselves. Just like these wise-hearted individuals who worked hard to establish the Mishkan, and he thinks this makes a lot of sense. So the context of this week's Parsha is not only in the shadows of the sin of the Egel HaZahav, there's another context, which is we are only building a temporary home for Hashem, on our way to building the ultimate home for Hashem. But although this was meant to be temporary, and it wasn't supposed to last long, and you may have thought, okay, Hashem, while we're traveling, he doesn't have to travel in so much style. When we arrive there, then we're going to build a palace for Hashem. No, we invested in this mitzvah, and we work hard, and we toiled, because you never know the relative value of any mitzvah. We have to do every single mitzvah in the most beautiful possible way. Now that we're a bit more familiar with the context, let's try and look at what happened itself. And we're now going to ask the question of the Orach Chaim HaKadosh, where he asks, is there such a thing as a fundraiser which is too successful? As he asks in source number 3, Marbim ha'am lahavi, the people came to Moshe and they said, listen, everybody's bringing too much. Kasha, the Orach Chaim says, this is difficult. Would it have been so terrible if the house of Hashem would have had treasure houses of gold for his glory and splendor? So you know what? Let people bring extra. Let them bring more. Let the Beit HaMikdash have huge gold reserves, or the Mishkan have huge gold reserves. Would that have been such a terrible thing? Why do you have to complain? Baruch Hashem. I'm sure if our organization had a fundraiser and there was a surplus, we'd find a way to use the surplus. Or maybe we'd put it on the side for a rainy day. But with a fundraiser, when there are too many funds, it's not such a terrible thing. Why did they complain? The Orach Chaim explains that we have to pay attention carefully to the wording of the psukim to understand exactly what was being brought here. And he says, Achein indeed, lo ba'u likbol al hamuva beit Hashem hazahav v'chesef, etc. The complaint was not about people bringing too much gold or too much silver. In fact, later on in the final section of this evening's shiur, we will see that we're not actually talking about such a huge amount of gold. Ella, what were we talking about? Al hamuva asui melacha. We were bringing too much of the things which we actually made with our own hands. Shehu davar she'ein tzorech bo. We didn't need extra things to be woven or made in certain ways. We brought actual items that could be used in the actual building, not just gold and silver, which could be put aside. Gam omed lehitkalkel kol sheyesh dai machzor, and these were items where they would be perishable. Were they to be left on the side? You couldn't just store these things. V'hu omran, that's what they said in the pasuk. They said, Marbim ha'am, the people are bringing too much. Midei ha'avodah la'malacha. They are bringing too much of the work for the creative activity. Perush, what does that mean? Marbim lahavi yoter mishior ha'avodah ha'tzricha la'malacha shetzivah Hashem. They're bringing too much of the actual materials that are being woven and made together by the people. Halamata, so we see she'al pirtei ha'avodah hikpidu. They didn't say they're bringing too much gold, or they're bringing too much silver, or bringing too many precious gemstones. In truth, that could have been put on the side. That could have entered a treasure house. But we brought too many actual materials to be included in the physical structure of the Mishkan. Va'ed ledvarenu, the Orach Chaim says this can be further proven from the announcement which was made, which was Ma'amar HaKruz. The announcement was Al yasu od melacha letrumat hakodesh. Stop doing melacha. Stop sewing, stop knitting, stop weaving, stop doing all of those things that you're doing. We don't need that anymore. Please, we have enough actual materials. And what are we going to do with all the extra materials once this Mishkan has been built? The second question I'd like to look at is on the interesting wording. I'm going back to source 1, which summarizes this passage. The Torah tells us, number 1, the malacha was dayam. There were sufficient purposes. There was enough. Like dayenu. There was enough. But then we're told, vehoter, and there was left over. From yoter, there was a surplus. How are we to understand this pasuk? How can there be both dayam, enough, and hoter, and a surplus? If there's a surplus, there's more than enough. If there's enough, there's enough. There isn't a surplus. Why is it both dayam and hoter? A practical explanation can be found in the Sforno at the bottom of page 1. Bit more pragmatic. He says, La sotota v'hoter. He says, La sotota hamlacha ula hoter. There was enough to do everything they needed to make and to have a little bit left over. But ofen shelo hayu tzrichim letzamtzem ofen asiyatam midaga pen yachzar hachomer, which meant that when they were fashioning the different parts of the Mishkan, nobody needed to be worried that they have to use the exact amounts available. Nobody had to worry about running out of any materials. There was just a little bit extra, which allowed us to do our work and build a Mishkan without any concerns, like any building project where you don't necessarily order the exact amount to the millimeter of the materials that you need, but you have a certain breathing space, which you build in to the budget to allow for people to work confidently, knowing that there's a little bit left on the side if required. So that's more of a practical explanation. There was enough and there was a bit more, because having a bit more is having enough. That's how you order. That's how you cater an event. So there's always a little bit left over. That's what it means that you have enough. However, going back to the Orach Chaim HaKadosh, now in source number 5, he has a different way of explaining this at the top of page 2. And he says, first he poses our question. Dayam v'hoter. Heim shnei devarim hafachiyim. These are two opposite things. Im dayam, if there's the right amount, eino hoter, then there isn't a surplus. V'im hoter, and if there's a surplus, eino dayam, it's not the right amount. How can it be both? V'od, and he says furthermore, kol hakatov miyutar, this entire pasuk appears to be superfluous. Sharei amar lamala, it says above, marbim ha'am lahavi midei avodah lamalacha. We've already been told that the people are bringing along too much work for the creative activities of the Mishkan. Well, if people are bringing too much, upshita, it's obvious. Shelo amruchen ad shesharu. Obviously, when they said that everyone's bringing too much, they must have measured and there would have been too much. So we know that there's too much already. So then why do we have to go along and say that there was enough and even more? That whole sentence is seemingly superfluous because we've already had the complaint that people are bringing too much. The Orach Chaim goes on to explain. V'ulai sheyashmienu hakatuv chibat b'nei Yisrael b'einei hamakom. Maybe what the Torah is talking about here is how much Hashem loved us. At the commencement of the shiur, I brought an idea of Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky about how much we loved Hashem and how much we were excited to do something for Hashem. Now we're talking about how much Hashem loved us, and indeed love is the great theme of Vayakel Pekudei. It is the reunification of us and Hashem and the rebuilding of our relationship after the disastrous breakdown into that relationship at the Egel HaZahav. And here we see how much Hashem loves us. Why? Ki letzad sheheviu Yisrael yoter mishior hatzarich. People brought too much, and then Hashem was concerned. Chash Hashem lekavod kol ish shetarchu veheviu. Hashem was concerned about the honor of every single person who with their own funds and with their own efforts and with their own hands went and made the effort to bring these things for the Mishkan. And as a result, v'nichnas kol hamuva beit Hashem b'melechet HaMishkan, everything which was donated, everything that was brought, found a place inside the building of the Mishkan. V'zeh shi'ur hakatuv, and that is the meaning when the Torah tells us. V'hamalacha shetziva Hashem lasot b'mishkan, the malacha that Hashem commanded to do in the Mishkan. Hespika likanes betocha, kol hamalacha shasu b'nei Yisrael, hagam shehoter. It's true, we donated too much, but nevertheless Hashem miraculously allowed everything that was donated to find its place within the structure of the Mishkan. Perush, which means shaya yoter matzarich. Hispik hamekabel lekabel yoter mishiuro al yedei nes. Yes, at the very same time, there was too much, and then there was the exact amount. And that was a miracle, that although we donated too much, Hashem enabled every single donation to find its place in the Mishkan, because Hashem wanted every single person who made that effort and had that expression of love for Hashem to be able to come to the Mishkan and know, I made my contribution and my contribution is part of this Mishkan. Hashem didn't want anybody to have worked hard at home and to have worked with materials and given of their own possessions, and for those not to actually be used for this project. And therefore, although there was too much, miraculously, it ended up being the exact amount. And intentionally, it was the exact amount, so that every single person's donation was crucial for the building of the Mishkan. And the Mishkan, if there was an exact amount, could not have been built without their donation. That's the way we explain that it was both Dayam and Hoter, according to the Orach Chaim. But now I'd like to share with you a different explanation, which is an almost opposite explanation. They can live together, but it's a completely different way of understanding this, from Rabbi Mordechai Kamenetsky. And I will quote with you a story which he told in a drasha, which he published in 2002. The story is as follows. President John F. Kennedy loved to tell the story of a political battle for the mayoralty of the small manufacturing city of Fall River in Massachusetts. It was the tightest race in Massachusetts history. During the vote counting, the candidates sat nervously with their supporters, awaiting the final tally. It took days to declare and weeks to finally confirm that the winner of the mayoral race was actually decided by one vote. And actually, you can Google in history, there have been some fascinating occasions where elections, mainly in America, have ended up being decided by a single vote. So the winner was obviously very happy with this result, but the winner's jubilation was muted only days after the results were declared. You see, everyone in the town reminded him it was my vote that got you elected. And so that mayor, although he won the election, ended up having a terrible time because everybody felt that he owed them something. And everybody kept reminding him that if not for them, he would never have been appointed. And that was an impossible situation for the mayor to handle. And actually, it was not a very successful candidacy. So too, when it came to the building of the Mishkan, Rabbi Kamenetsky, this time Rabbi Mordechai Kamenetsky, explains. If it were not for me, some may have thought, there would be no Mishkan. I gave the contribution that turned the tide. Everybody would have pinned the success on his or her copper or silver or gold. The only way this false pride could be avoided was if there was a bit more given to the cause than actually was needed. Only then would you not only have a Mishkan, but an edifice bereft of individual haughtiness. Therefore, only when there was more given than was actually needed did Moshe feel he truly had enough. According to Rav Mordechai Kamenetsky, enough wasn't enough. If there was dayam, if there was the exact amount, everybody would have felt a sense of entitlement regarding the Mishkan. Everybody would have felt a sense of arrogance and haughtiness, saying, this entire Mishkan is there because of me. If not for my donation, we wouldn't have made it. It's thanks to what I did, what I gave. And Hashem and Moshe did not want that to be the case. They didn't want anybody to have that sense of arrogance when coming to the Mishkan. And so intentionally, there was more than enough so that nobody could say it was my donation which enabled the Mishkan to be built. So it's almost the complete opposite of the Orach Chaim HaKadosh. According to the Orach Chaim, everybody's donation was miraculously included so that everybody could say, my donation was crucial to the Mikdash. According to Rabbi Kamenetsky, intentionally there was a surplus so that nobody could say that it was their donation which built the Mikdash. And whilst these are opposite messages, of course they are both true, that we need to find a way for people to contribute. And everybody, not just the individuals who have been blessed to be conduits of Hashem's blessing in this world in very generous and large ways, but everybody should feel that they should contribute, and everybody should feel that their contribution is important. And we must ensure that everybody can feel that they have a contribution to our communal institutions and the things that we share together. At the same time, while everybody should be able to contribute and everybody should be able to feel that they are contributing, nobody should feel that sense of entitlement or the arrogance which comes along by saying that this project is only there because of me. And therefore, whilst we want everybody to have a sense of ownership of the community, that ownership should not become an ownership which is one of arrogance and therefore difficult. Difficult for the community, difficult for those individuals, and as we're going to see as well soon, difficult for Hashem. And this concept that the Mishkan itself was a place, a home for humility, appears as well in our second Parsha this week, Parshat Pikudei. Pikudei is an accounting and a reckoning of everything which was donated and contributed to the Mishkan. And in that context, we have in source number 7, towards the end of page 2, which is towards the beginning of Parshat Pikudei. Kol hazahav ha'asui lamlacha b'chol melechet hakodesh. We have all of the gold which was made for the malacha, for all of this holy work. Vayihi zahav hatnufa, and the zahav of this offering was Teisha ve'esrim kikar, 29 talents, ushvamot ushloshim shekel b'shekel hakodesh, and 730 shekels of the holy shekels. It sounds like a lot of gold, but the Sforno in source number 8 somewhat dampens the atmosphere at the beginning of Parshat Pikudei, and he says, it's actually not that much gold. As we see at the bottom of page 2 in the Sforno, Kol HaZahav, all of the gold, He'id al kitzbat HaZahav v'hakesef v'hanachoshet shenichnesa b'melechet HaMishkan. At this stage of Parshat Pikudei, we have a description of all the gold and the silver and the copper, which joined his whole Mishkan building project. And he says, you should know, Shaya davar mu'at me'od. This was very little, be'erech, when compared to el ha'osher shahaya b'bayit rishon, the great wealth which existed in the first Beit HaMikdash. K'mavua b'sefer Malachim, and if you open up Malachim and Malachim Aleph chapter 6 or in Malachim Aleph chapter 7 and you read through the psukim there's a description of the tremendous wealth and gold and opulence of the Beit HaMikdash. So the Sforno says, you know what? Compared to the Beit HaMikdash, it's actually not that much gold. And that's compared to the first Beit HaMikdash. And he says, V'yoter mimeno, even more than that, Ha'osher shehaya b'binyan Hordos, the second Beit HaMikdash built by Herod. Wow, if you look at this Gemara there in Sota, Perek Haya Notel, you'll read there about how the second Beit HaMikdash had even more gold and wealth and opulence. So the Mishkan, compared to the first Beit HaMikdash, and even more so compared to the second Beit HaMikdash, when you look at the actual materials and how much gold there was, it doesn't actually appear to be that much. But there's another way we compare the Mishkan. We can compare the Mishkan to the two Batei Mikdash at the top of page 3. Nevertheless, v'im kol zeh, yoter hitmid mar'eh kavod Hashem b'mishkan shel Moshe mima shehitmid b'mikdash rishon. Nevertheless, let's forget about the price tag here. The glory of Hashem was a more constant presence in the humble Mishkan than it was in the wealthier, more opulent first Beit HaMikdash. V'lo nireh klal b'mikdash sheni, and it didn't appear at all in the second Beit HaMikdash. And so we see here an inverse correlation. The humble Mikdash, relatively, it was beautiful, yes, but made relatively out of a little bit of gold, had a much stronger and more persistent and consistent presence of Hashem than the first Beit HaMikdash, and how much more so the second Beit HaMikdash. The more gold there was, the less there was the presence of Hashem. And the Sforno says that from here we learn an important lesson. Uvazeh hora, this teaches us, Shelo kitzbat ha'osher v'godel habinyan yusiba lahashrot shchina b'Yisrael. It's not a question of how wealthy a budget is or how big the building is, which will cause the divine presence to rest among us. That's not what's going to create a space for Hashem in our midst, to feel at home in our midst, to move into our midst. But rather, aval. Rotzeh Hashem et yireiav, u'ma'asehem l'shachna b'tocham. Hashem wants the people who fear him, and Hashem wants their deeds. Hashem wants our behavior in order to rest amongst us. The wealthier the edifice, the less the presence of Hashem. The more humble the edifice, the more intense we experience the presence of Hashem, because Hashem resides where there is humility. Hashem likes humble buildings, and Hashem likes humble people. That doesn't mean our buildings shouldn't be beautiful. Zeh keliva and vehu, we have to invest in doing everything beautifully for Hashem. But we should understand that it's not the building itself and the beauty of the building and the cost of the building that makes Hashem rest there. It is within the people and their deeds that there is space for Hashem. And this is taught to us in the Gemara in Sotain, source number 9. Amar Rav Chisda taught. V'itema Mar Ukva and Mar Ukva taught. Kol Adam sheyesh bo gasut haruach. If there's any individual who has haughtiness, arrogance, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem says about that person, Ein ani v'hu yicholin ladur ba'olam. There isn't space in this world for the both of us, Hashem says. When there's an arrogant person, Hashem says, there's no space for me. If that person's ego fills their surroundings, where's there going to be space for Hashem? Hashem rests where there is humility. And to create space for Hashem to rest amongst us, we have to understand that we're not so big and important ourselves. When we ourselves are humble, when we ourselves are modest, that leaves room for the presence of Hashem. And the more humble we are, the more intense Hashem's presence will be among us. And that's what Rabbi Mordechai Kamenetsky was describing with the project of the donations to the Mishkan. Moshe didn't want the Mishkan to be a home of arrogance. He wanted it to be a home of humility. And therefore, intentionally, there was too much. Intentionally, the budget was larger than we actually needed, so that nobody would be conceited in the home of Hashem. And if we go to the beginning of this week's first Parsha, Parshat Vayakel, and we understand it in its proper context, we see again this message about humility shining through. Parshat Vayakel commences. Vayakel Moshe et kol adat b'nei Yisrael. And Moshe congregated the entire assembly of the Israelites. Vayomer alehem, and he said unto them, Eile hadvarim asher tzivah Hashem nafsot otam. These are the things that Hashem commanded us to do. The Orach Chaim in source number 11 points out, Vayakel Moshe, etc. Moshe congregated. Tzarich lada'at ta'am shehutzrach lomar Vayakel. We need to know the reason why it was necessary for the Torah to tell us that Moshe got everybody together. Whenever Moshe passes on a message from Hashem and commands us the word of Hashem, he gets everybody together. It goes without saying. Why does Vayakel tell us? Vayakel, Moshe brought everybody together. Obviously, that's what he did when he addressed us. But the Orach Chaim says, Vinir et appears. Ki letzad shera'u ki karan or panav vayiru migeshet elav. You need to understand. Everybody saw that light was radiating from Moshe's face. And so we were scared of coming close to Moshe. Lezeh hutzrach lakil et kulan. That's why Moshe needed to make an effort to get everybody to come together, to bring everybody close to him. Leval yimna'u ktzat mehamoreh mara. So that they wouldn't hold back a bit because of the fear. That's why I say Moshe brought together et kol adat b'nei Israel, the entire assembly of b'nei Israel, because some people were scared of Moshe. Now, the skeptics and cynics amongst you might be saying, that sounds like a midrash. But it's not a midrash. If we look at the end of last week's Parsha, this is the exact context which leads into the beginning of Parshat Vayakel. So let's read in source 12, the very end of Parshat Ki Tisa. Vayihi, and it was. Beredet Moshe mehar Sinai, when Moshe descended Har Sinai, Ushnei luchot ha'idot biad Moshe, beredoto min hahar. And there were the 2 tablets of testimony in the hand of Moshe when he came down the mountain. Moshe lo yada ki karan or panav dabro ito. Moshe was unaware that karan or panav, the skin on his face, was radiating with light when Hashem spoke to him. By the way, when you see the Michelangelo's picture of Moshe where he's got those little horns, it's because of a mistranslation. They thought Karan here was from Keren, horns, but Moshe didn't have horns. Karan means radiating rays of light. It doesn't mean horns. Now, Moshe, this is how humble Moshe is. Moshe doesn't even know that his face was turned into a light bulb. Vayar Aaron v'chol b'nei Israel et Moshe. So Aaron and all the Israelites see Moshe. B'nei karan or panav, and yes, his light was shining. Vayiru migeshet elav. So people were scared of coming close to Moshe. Vayikra lehem Moshe. So Moshe called them. But let's pay attention. When Moshe called us, who came? Vayashuv elav Aaron v'chol hanesiim ba'edah. Aaron and all of the Nesiim, the princes, returned, came towards Moshe. Vaydaber Moshe alehem, and Moshe spoke to them. We didn't all run to Moshe. Only Aaron and the Nesiim came close. People were scared. It was only afterwards that all the Israelites approached. And then he commanded them everything that Hashem had told us on Har Sinai. And then we have a situation where Moshe Rabbeinu needs to put on a mask. Moshe stopped speaking to them. So he placed a mask over his face. And this is how they managed to navigate this distance between the people and Moshe. When Hashem came before Hashem to speak to him, when Moshe came before Hashem to speak to him, he was able to remove the mask while he was in that encounter until he left. Then he would go out and he would report the news to the Bnei Israel. But then once again, the Israelites would see Moshe's face, kikaran or panei Moshe, that the skin of Moshe's face was illuminated. And as a result, Ve'hishiv Moshe et hamasveh al panav. So Moshe returned the mask to his face, and bo'u ledaber ito, until they would then feel comfortable to come and speak to him. That's the end of Parshat Ki Tisa, which leads into the beginning of Parshat Vayakel. We have this whole situation of masks and distancing and light on the face, and then that runs into Vayakel Moshe et kol adat bnei Israel. Moshe had to bring everybody together because it was an effort to bring everybody together. That's why we're told that he brought us all together. Now, where did the light on Moshe's face come from? I asked this question last week in Shul after the Hashkama minyan. So for those of you who were there, this is somewhat of a revision. According to some opinions, that light came about when Moshe was with Hashem on Har Sinai receiving the Torah. It was reflected illumination from that special encounter. According to another opinion, the light on Moshe's face came about from that moment where he stood in the cleft in the rock and Hashem placed his palm over Moshe and then he passed over him. And it was that special encounter with Hashem, that one where Moshe saw Hashem from behind and not from in front. That's what left that special shining radiance on Moshe's face. However, the Or HaChaim in source number 13 brings us the Midrash, which explains in a different way why Moshe's face was radiating. Over Midrash in the Midrash. Rav Yehuda bar Nachman Amar, it's taught. Kishekatav Moshe HaTorah. When Moshe wrote the Torah, Nishtayer bekulmos kima. There was a little bit of ink left over. Veheviru al rosho. So it was then passed over Moshe's face. Umisham naaseh karnei hod ad kan. And that's where the shining countenance came from on Moshe's face. There was a little bit of ink left over when Moshe wrote the Torah, and therefore that ink was placed over Moshe's face. It's actually an ink stain which made Moshe's face shine in that way. And the Or HaChaim says, V'divreihem zal stumim v'chatumim. These words of our sages of blessed memory are just completely impossible to understand. What on earth is going on here? And he goes on to say that maybe they were trying to teach us an important message here. Because we have to ask, why is there leftover ink at all? I can understand with a project which is being led by humans, as we described before, humans working on a building project, we want to have a little bit of leftover materials. And when you're catering a meal and you've got guests coming around, you'll cook maybe just a little bit more than you need to. You want to have a bit of leftover to be sure, But when you're writing the Torah, this is a project where the supplies are being provided by Hashem on Har Sinai. Hashem didn't need to have a little bit of extra ink just in case. Hashem only needed the exact amount of ink for this project. But the Orach Chaim says that here we can learn a very big lesson. V'ulai, maybe the message of this midrash is, what they're trying to teach us is that the character trait of humility is supreme. Umatzinu, because we find the Torah told us about Moshe, she'anav me'od mikol ha'adam. We're told in Bamidbar that Moshe was the most humble human being who's ever lived on the face of the earth. Uchsha'amar Hashem lichtav hadvarim. When Hashem told Moshe to write this down, matzinu lo shelo katav anav. Moshe didn't spell the word anav in the Torah, ayin, nun, yud, vav. Ela anav, he wrote it ayin, nun, vav, chasera yud. He missed out the letter yud from the word anav. Va'af ze min ha'anava, and that itself was an expression of anava. Moshe didn't want to write how humble he was in capital letters with a full word, ayin, nun, yud, vav. So he wrote it, he dropped the yud from the word anav. Moshe, in an act of humility, wrote the word humility in a more humble way. But what does that mean? It means that there's a little bit of ink left over from that letter yud. And that is the leftover ink, which then went on Moshe's face. And it was in the merit of this that Moshe merited that shining face. There's another opinion of where this little bit of ink came from, which is from the beginning of the book of Vayikra, where Moshe wrote the word Vayikra with a small aleph instead of a big aleph to make it look as if Vayikra, that Hashem chanced upon Moshe, which is a more humble word than Vayikra. Hashem called to Moshe, suggesting a special relationship, and that's why there was a little bit of ink left over, which went over Moshe's face. But what's the common denominator of these opinions? We see on both occasions. What's being described is that there's a bit of leftover ink because Moshe did not want the limelight. Moshe was a humble person, the most humble person who's ever lived. But what happened as a result of Moshe escaping the limelight? His face became a source of shining and radiating light itself. And that is the message. From the beginning of this week's first Parsha, Vayakel, Moshe had to get everybody together because they were scared of him. Why were they scared of him? Because his face was so bright. Why did his face shine so brightly? It was his humility shining through. And he was so humble that he didn't even know at the beginning that his face was shining at all. And here we have an example of the rule in the Gemara in Eruvin, our final source 14, Eruvin Daf Yud Gimel Amud Bet. Kol hamachazeh al hagdula. If anybody runs after greatness, gdula borachet mimenu, greatness runs away from that person. V'chol haboreach min hagdula. However, if somebody runs away from greatness, gdula machazeret acharav, then greatness runs after that person. If you want to be great, run away from greatness. And don't run away from greatness and keep looking over your shoulder to check if it's catching up with you. That's not really running away from greatness. Genuinely running away from greatness. If we are humble people, modest people, who don't look for the limelight, but just look to make a meaningful contribution, then we can learn from Moshe Rabbeinu. And we can learn from all those individuals who made such a meaningful contribution to this week's Parsha, The message is that everybody should contribute, and everybody should feel that they contribute, and everybody should have a role to play. But within that, nobody should be so arrogant or conceited as to say that without me, none of this should be possible. We should all contribute, but do so in a humble way. If everything is now going according to plan, I invite Rabbi Mark Steiner to make Rabbi Asulin the host of this meeting. And he will now be able to take over and to continue teaching us in Ivrit. And I encourage you all to continue learning together with Rav Asulin. I wish you all a good evening or a good morning or a good afternoon and a Shabbat Shalom.